A record number of students tested positive for COVID this week. What does that mean for Duke? I'm Jake Sheridan, and you're listening to Duke Week, the Chronicle's weekly news podcast. Today, we're going to hear from Duke University press workers about their effort to unionize. Then, Chronicle sports editor Jake Piazza will give us an update on an alliance of sports conferences the ACC helped forge, the football team's upcoming season, and new rules allowing student athletes to make money off their image and likeness. But first, the Chronicle's managing editor, Nadia Bey, is going to lay out what's going on with COVID at Duke. Hey, Nadia, how's it going?
Going good. How are you?
I'm good. No one ever asked me that. So 304 undergraduate students tested positive. How are they doing, and are they vaccinated?
Yeah, so the majority of infected people are asymptomatic or have mild viral symptoms. The majority were vaccinated, as is most of Duke's population. 98% of students and 92% of employees are vaccinated at this point.
So last March, when around 180 students tested positive, Duke shut down. We have the vaccines and things have changed, but what's Duke doing now?
Duke's current approach is definitely a bit more lenient than it was in previous semesters, although they've also been reintroducing more stringent protocols for a few weeks now, starting with the indoor mask mandate back in July that initially didn't apply to residence halls, but now it does. There was also the eventual reinstatement of the outdoor mask mandate, first in large groups, and now a blanket mandate. The university's vaccine mandate for staff was also made a condition of employment just this past Sunday. There are also the gradual changes to dining. I literally had breakfast in West Union this morning, aka Broadhead Center, and now indoor dining is suspended. And that's after the university suggested eating outdoors under tents, since communal dining has been shown to be conducive to spread. And one of the other big changes is that classes can now be taught remotely for 2 weeks because of increased student absences. And that was after last week saying instructors did not necessarily need to provide remote learning to students. Although in my experience, one of my classes is recorded and one of my other instructors uses Zoom during lecture. So it's not like professors are refusing to provide remote learning to students. That's still an option. It's just that they're not necessarily required to. So there are definitely instructors making accommodations, but of course it's still a very case-by-case thing.
So how many graduate students and faculty members tested positive?
45 graduate students and 15 employees tested positive in the past week.
Do we have any sense of why this spread might be happening?
At least for students, the most likely cause would be gatherings outside of class, especially larger gatherings. Duke has already stated that there hasn't really been transmission in the classroom, and previous clusters with medical school students and with athletes, those happen around gatherings as well, according to university. And since this year feels a little bit closer to normal, I think people are returning to their old social behaviors, but where we are now is not where we were in fall. Also, last week, we learned that instructors weren't required to be notified if students tested positive for COVID-19, as it's protected health information, and instructors will only be notified if they're contact traced ultimately. However, students are also told to submit a STIN or incapacitation form if they go into isolation and follow up with their instructors for accommodations. And so I think there is some level of communication going on between instructors and students, but that communication is not necessarily coming from the university.
Thank you so much for your coverage today, and thanks for hopping on.
Yeah, thanks.
By the way, an email sent by Student Affairs later Monday made it clear that students are supposed to mask up when gathering off campus and not gather with over 50 people. Do you want to join the Chronicle? It's not too late. You could still write stories, take photos, or even start your own podcast for Duke's independent student newspaper, and we'd love to have you. Just head to cron.it/join and fill out our interest form. Again, that's cron.it/join. Duke University press workers moved to unionize earlier this year, and now that effort might be coming to a conclusion. Dan Ruccia has been a marketing designer for the press for 8 years, and he's also a member of the press's not yet university recognized workers union. He told me that press workers want more control over working conditions and salaries that reflect their experience, especially as life in Durham becomes more expensive. Here he is. So walk me through what's happened so far as you guys try to unionize.
Yeah, so the brief timeline, in late March, the union went public and announced our intention, our campaign. In early May, we filed with the National Labor Relations Board for an election. That election took place mostly by mail, but also a little bit in person over the month of June. And ballots were counted on June 29th.
And how did that election go? Do you know what the results are yet? Or
Yeah, so as of the end of the vote count, there were 35 yes votes, 31 no votes, and 8 challenged ballots, which are ballots for whom either the union or Duke believed should not be counted, that they should not be, their positions, their responsibilities made it such that they were not eligible to be voters. So because the number of challenged ballots was greater than the difference between the yeses and nos, we then had to adjudicate those challenges. At the same time, about a week later, Duke filed formal objection to the conduct of the election for a few reasons. And at this point, closing briefs in that are being filed on Monday. And then we're just going to be waiting to hear the hearing officer's ruling.
So how do you expect that to go?
I mean, I think we feel good about where things are going to go. We think that, we laid out a pretty solid case that the objections to the conduct of the election that Duke made were basically meaningless and baseless and an attempt to just delay things. We have just a handful of challenges that are still to be determined, and we feel confident in all of them. And we are pretty sure that, when the hearing officer makes his ruling, that we will come out with come out ahead, that we'll have the votes that we need to win certification and thus start the process of negotiating.
I read in some of the Chronicle's past coverage that, some workers wanted to vote against unionizing because they feared losing their current health benefits. And, you mentioned that 31 Duke University Press workers voted against unionizing. How do you respond to those fears?
There are, 4 active unions on campus. I've seen contracts for 2 of them, and we've talked to folks from the others, and they all include, language that says, we get Duke benefit, the same Duke insurance, the same health insurance that everyone else at Duke gets. Duke has a precedent for that kind of language in their contracts. Honestly, those concerns raised by my coworkers feel like sort of baseless fear mongering. It's a classic anti-union line to basically say everything is up for grabs in negotiations, therefore things will, we have to start from ground zero rather than, we have to renegotiate for all the things we already have. Things might be worse off. But, if union negotiations, if negotiating with management resulted in workers getting worse benefits, management, corporations, the powerful folks who oppose unions would be on board immediately. They'd say, yes, let's negotiate so we don't have to pay as much for benefits.
In early August, IndieWeek reported that Duke hired a law firm with an anti-union reputation to fight the unionization effort. How do you think Duke has acted during your unionization effort?
Duke has a long history of opposing unionization. We knew going in that Duke was going to, not necessarily pull out the stops, but they were definitely going to oppose our efforts to unionize. We weren't surprised. It still doesn't make it, there are still better ways we think that Duke and the press could spend their money than on expensive law firms to oppose their workers.
Thanks, Dan, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Duke spokesperson Mike Schoenfeld previously told IndieWeek that Duke regularly engages counsel on complex legal issues. He told the Chronicle in May that Duke supports the right of each worker to vote on representation. We've got Chronicle sports editor Jake Piazza here. Jake, I saw the ACC, Big Ten, and Pac-12 are forming an alliance. What are those sports conferences going to be doing together?
I would say the best way to characterize it as a kind of scheduling agreement. Based on the press conference, there is no legal written document or anything. It's really just an agreement of trust is the word they use between the 3 commissioners. And it's largely just going to be used to schedule more high-profile non-conference matchups between the 3 of them.
So what does that mean for Duke?
For Duke, it's very difficult to see at the moment, largely because a lot of kind of details on the concrete steps that the alliance is going to take initially are still very up in the air. But, if I'm just kind of speculating, it's like you get to see things like, oh, Duke, Stanford, the East and the West Coast schools, why don't they just schedule each other in football now as part of a regular thing? Things like that are supposed to be easier and more frequent now that these three conferences have an alliance.
So Duke's football team plays UNC Charlotte on Friday. It's the first game of the season. How's the football team looking?
Unfortunately for the Blue Devil faithful, I would say expectations for the season are definitely on the lower side, kind of in that 6-win range, gunning for a bowl. I do think a bowl is definitely in the equation, but it's certainly not going to be a look back to the old Daniel Jones days.
And why is that?
They're dealing with some pretty big losses. Namely, the two that come to mind are Chris Rumpf and Victor Dimukeje on that defensive line, as well as their stud safety, Michael Carter II, all three of those guys to the NFL. And I wouldn't say that they're necessarily a young team, but experience-wise, they got some guys in positions that haven't played a lot of snaps. So I think that's going to be kind of growing pains early on. And that's kind of the name of the game is we'll see how long those growing pains last and see if they can piece together enough wins to get into one of those bowl games.
Interesting. So another thing that's new this year, college athletes can make money off their name, image, and likeness for the first time. Have any Duke student athletes taken up that offer?
Well, I think the one that comes to mind first, Wendell Moore has a deal with Bojangles. I think he just posted it on his Instagram and Twitter one day. So you got that. Paulo Banchero signed a NIL representation deal with CAA Basketball, which is a massive sports agency firm that a guy by the name of Zion Williamson's also signed with. You guys may have heard of him. And then I think another one, a number of athletes across some of the Olympic sports have done the Barstool Sport athletes deal that a ton of athletes across the country have signed with. Those are kind of the three that jump out to mind first.
I'm going to have to really step up my pickup basketball game so I can get one of these Bojangles deals.
Absolutely. The chicken sandwiches look pretty good too.
Are there any other sports teams that look like they're ready to have a really good season?
I think you got to go to women's soccer right now. They just won their 4th game in a row to start the season on Sunday. They've shut out 2 opponents in a row. And I think, all eyes on campus have got to go over to Koskinen Stadium to watch them play a few games.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Jake.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
In other news, Duke students isolated and positive for COVID-19 received a warning for, quote, malicious, disrespectful violations of quarantine policy. The Chronicle obtained an email sent from the Pandemic Response Unit to quarantine students that cited litter and loud, unmasked gatherings. Donna Jones is the new director of the Mary Lou Williams Center for Black Culture. She comes from UNC Chapel Hill, where she was assistant dean of students, and told our reporter Nadia Bey that her primary goal is ensuring that the Mary Lou feels like Granny's living room for students and Durhamites alike. Dean Sue Wasilek has moved out of the Gilbert Adams Residence Hall. She was a faculty in residence there for 8 years, and as our features editor Chris Kuo wrote, she's been a big part of the Duke community for 40 years now. No longer dean of students, she's leaving the university for other higher ed work. I'll never forget her standing guard over a bench as a horde of students gathered around hoping to burn it after Duke beat UNC. And even as one student offered her a strong pull from a handle of vodka, Dean Sue did not relent. That's all for this episode of Duke Week. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe, share it with your friends, and help us get out the word that the Chronicle's got a weekly news podcast. That song you heard is called Goji Berry Beat by Nana Kwabena. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again next week.